Scenes and Adventures in the Semi-Alpine region of the Ozark Mountains of Missouri and Arkansas, 1853, by Henry Rowe, Schoolcraft. Chapter 13, Part 1, Number 25. The canoe had not yet arrived, nor was there any tidings of it the next morning, so that there was no alternative in our present situation but to wait patiently. I determined to improve the delay by exploring the neighborhood. It is a geographical point of some importance, being the head of the navigation of White River for all large craft ascending from the Mississippi. As yet, nothing but keel boats have ascended. Between the point of our embarkation at Beaver Creek and this spot, the river has a fall of about 60 feet at 4 rapids, which do not probably extend over a mile or two in the aggregate. The stream during the rest of the way has a fine, lively current, seldom of great velocity, and never stagnates. The great North Fork, the scene of our former ramblings, enters a short distance below the foot of the Buffalo Shoals, rendering the draught of water practicable, it is believed, for steamboats at all seasons. I found the Pebble Stones and boulders on the margin and bed of the river, which I leisurely examined to afford a true representation of the formations which had been observed in traversing the elevated and broken surface of the Ozarks. They consist of the various limestones and sandstones of the region, with a partial mixture of quartz rock, red syenite, hornstone, argillaceous rock, and the peculiar, egg-shaped, coarse yellow jasper, which appears to have been embedded in some of its strata. On ascending the cliffs west of the valley, they were observed to consist of the characteristic limestone of the region in horizontal layers, the upper strata containing impressions of shales. Very large angular masses of quartz rock lie near the bases of these cliffs. Some of the angles of these masses would probably measure 14 feet. Their position here appears to be quite anomalous, as from the absence of attrition they are clearly not of the erratic block group. They appear to indicate a primitive formation near. The half-hunter, half-farmer, to whom we had loaned our canoe, came with a number of his companions in the evening and entered on a scene of merriment, to which, as the cabin had but one room, we were compelled to be unwilling spectators during the livelong night, though from its character not participating at all therein. As soon as there was light sufficient to discern objects, 16th, we embarked, rejoiced to get clear of this extraordinary nocturnal scene. About half a mile below, we passed the mouth of the great North Fork, and some 5 or 6 miles further entered and descended a swift channel, called the Crooked Rapids, where there probably has been some slight geological disturbance in the bed of the river, observable in very low stages of water. At the distance of 10 miles more, a sudden turn of the river brought us all in full sight of the picturesque, elevated, and precipitous shore, called the Calico Rock. This presents a most imposing facade, on which are observable the imitative forms of fantastic architectural devices. The wall is quite precipitous throughout. It is the calcareous rock of the region. Its summit is overlaid with ochreous clays of various colors, which, through the action of the elements, have imparted their fanciful hues to portions of the cliff. This abrupt species of scenery is quite peculiar to the American landscape. A still more imposing section of it is presented in the pictured rocks of Lake Superior. Nothing of this kind marks the banks of the Rhine, so much eulogized by travelers, for all its formations partake of the parabolic or curved lines of the primitive, and the eye is relieved by these gradations. But in the brusque scenes of the west, The precipices are as marked as if they had been hewn down by some gigantic broadaxe. There are some sections in keeping with these harsh landscapes on the Mississippi along the Missouri shores, less prominently along the Illinois borders near Alton, and at places in Iowa and Wisconsin, but more characteristic in Minnesota, as the river escapes from its primitive plains and plunges over the falls of St. Anthony. We descended about 30 miles this day, and found lodgment at night at a house on the left bank occupied by Mr. Jeffrey. The next morning, 17th, on descending 5 miles, we stopped at Mr. Williams's to prepare breakfast, where some persons were gathering to hear an itinerant preacher. 20 miles lower, we stopped for the night at a widow Lafferty's. From the remarks made at the places where we have been entertained by the hunters and settlers on this river, there is considerable dissatisfaction with the treaty made with the Cherokee Indians, by which a part of that nation are assigned a location between the north banks of the Arkansas and the south bank of White River. Many of them, including our hostess tonight and the McGarrys, Lees, and Matneys above, have lands in cultivation, with dwelling houses, stock, and improvements of more or less value on the south banks of the river, which, as they apprehend, under the operation of this treaty, they are to relinquish to the Cherokees. The truth is, the first white occupants of the frontiers, though generally rough men and without a title to the lands they settle on, are the pioneers of civilization, and by thus taking their lives in their hands and encountering the perils of the wilderness and of Indian hostility, they lay the government under a strong obligation to protect them. The natural hatred of races is such that they are everlastingly on ill terms with the Indians, and the Indians with them. It is difficult to say which of the two races during this period of contact is most suspicious of the other. The Indians also look up to the government with strong claims for justice and protection. The frontier at the beginning of the 16th century was on and near the Atlantic borders from Maine to Georgia, and long continued east of the Allegheny Mountains. It is already west of the Mississippi River that mighty geographical highway, which, like a longitudinal line, stretches across 17 degrees of latitude, every mile of which will ere long be settled and cultivated by the Anglo-American race. As the population presses first on the Indian's hunting grounds and next on his cornfields, he flies before the irresistible tide and takes shelter at some more remote western point. But he is hardly well seated on his new hunting grounds. He has hardly begun to reap his new cornfields, when the pioneers of the same race that disturbed him before are upon him, and again he must fly before the resistless, the uncontrollable tide of migration. It is a providential reflux in the wave of races. It is something to be observed rather than to be apprehended and understood. It seems to say that the surface of the habitable earth was not formed for the permanent occupancy of races who rely on the pleasing and exciting uses of the bow and arrow, and that labor, which was at the first declared to be the proper condition of man, is destined to sweep away, if it cannot merge in its onrush, these erratic and picturesque tribes. Where their frontiers will be found 100 years hence, a voice of history looking to the past may only tell, but this appears more appreciable and clear, that the perpetuation of the race as one of the elements of mankind must depend, in the sequel, however long that sequel be postponed, on his substantial adoption of the principles of industry, letters, and Christianity. The tents of Shem, however we may read the prediction, are still to be occupied, if they are not now, by a broad philanthropy, to be merged into those of the higher civilization of Japhet. For the civilization and the moral elevation of man is the great object of revelation, and it appears clear and conformable to reason that where future history is taught in the Pentateuch by figures, it should be figuratively and not dogmatically explained. On leaving Mrs. Lafferty's in the morning of the 18th, we descended about 5 miles and stopped to breakfast at a Mr. Jones's. Rumor had pointed out that this place is the locality of a tin mine. The frontiersmen are greatly disposed to excite each other's imaginations by reports of mines and discoveries, every one of which is fancied to be some new Potosi or El Dorado. Our host was not backward in bringing to me some specimens of his supposed treasure. It consisted of several heavy lumps of the ore called by mineralogists iron glance. It had the usual color, great weight, and high metallic luster. He represented it as occurring in large bodies about 8 or 10 miles north of his house, on high lands at the surface. We had proceeded some miles on our way when a large black bear was discovered on the shore. It appeared to be about to plunge in for the purpose of crossing the river, when our presence alarmed it, and the animal, with its usual clumsy gait, betook himself to the woods again. The clumsiness of this animal's motion seems to be owing to the bluntness of its hind paws, which appear as if we should suppose it arose from recurved legs. The Indians laugh at the gait of bruin. We had encountered this species several times before, and always, as on this occasion, found it disposed to flee. 15 miles below Jones's cabin, we passed Hardin's Ferry, the house being on the right bank, and 2 miles further on we passed Morrison's Ferry. Continuing our descent 8 miles lower, we landed at a place called Pope Bayou, where we were hospitably received by Mr. Robert Bean. The river had now become a magnificent body of water, still clear and beautiful. We were here within the boundaries of the Mississippi alluvions. No highlands are visible for some distance before reaching Hardin's. The river winds through broad, fertile plains, bearing a most vigorous growth of forest trees. The banks are elevated some 30 feet above the water, and as the stream increases in depth and strength, they become subject to being undermined by the flood. The cane, which is common to the river in its entire length, even to the highest elevations of the Ozarks, is here of a tall and most vigorous growth. It is this plant, I apprehend, more than any other feature, which gives an oriental cast to these alluvial tracts, and I was almost ready at some points, where the growth concealed the trunks of the heavy forest, to see the hippopotamus and elephant display their clumsy forms. For these, however, we had the buffalo, the cougar, and the bear, whose crackling strength, as they passed through these reedy mazes, had on more than one occasion during our rambles reminded us of the great muscular power of these boasted objects of hunter skill and enterprise. Often had a fine dog in the narrations of the hunters paid the penalty of coming within the stroke of the latter, and we could sympathize with the loss of an animal which is of the highest value in his pursuits. It is due to this class of men to say that, however rough they are in their manners, we were uniformly received by them with a frank hospitality which appears to be always a point of honor with them. Nor did any of the number to whom reward was proffered for entertainment ever condescend to receive a cent for anything in the shape of food or lodging. The point of our landing was at the crossing of the lower Arkansas road. About 12 or 14 buildings of all sorts were clustered together, forming a small village which is now called Batesville, being the only one which had been encountered since leaving Potosi.